Good evening and a very warm welcome to all the viewers of the Mojo Story, our independent digital platform. In a moment from now, we will have a very special guest coming up. Raghuram Rajan, one of the most preeminent public intellectuals of our time, well-known economist and the former RBI governor, will be on our live stream this evening in India and this morning in the United States of America. I know a lot of you have signed up, have been waiting to hear him, especially at a time when the state of India's economy remains in sharp focus and a matter of great concern. Before we introduce him today, let's just look at some of the key indices. We know that the economy is in technical recession. This is, of course, a well-established definition, not something that is open to subjective interpretation. And it is now time to officially say that with the 24% GDP contraction and 2 consecutive quarters showing a decline in growth, we are officially in recession. There has been some degree of hope that people have attached to the figures that have just been released. The 7.5% GDP decline in the July-September area is being called better than the global average, which is hovering about 12% or a little over in 49 countries, according to the SPI. Is that really reason for hope? That's something we'll be putting to Professor Rajan. Even as the fiscal deficit widens to 9.53 lakh crores at a time when the government needs to be spending more and more to, in fact, create stimulus in a post-COVID turmoil-ridden country. Now, according to the CMIE, 21 million salaried Indians have lost their jobs between April and August. This could be one of the big untold stories of our time, and we're going to have to wait and watch this space to see how much worse this sector gets. At this time, our farmers, of course, are on the streets, and the new farm laws are triggering massive protest, and opinion is sharply divided over whether these are pro-reform or pro-crony capitalist. That is a question we'll be putting to the former governor as well, as he has slammed an RBI proposal to allow corporates to own banks. And that is something that both he and his former deputy, Viral Acharya, have collectively lambasted. So there's a lot to talk about. And without any delay, let me welcome Raghuram Rajan to the program. Welcome, Raghu. It's a pleasure seeing you this evening in India, your cold morning in Chicago, I imagine. We're here to talk about the state of India's economy, and I know you've spoken a lot about it, but there's been a lot that's been happening in the last few weeks, including this hope that's been attached to the 7.5% GDP decline, which some are saying is not as bad as was feared. State Bank of India analysis of more than 40 countries is saying it's actually better than the global average. Does it give you any hope at all?
Well, it's better than the 23% decline in the first quarter. So yes, we didn't have a serious lockdown in the second quarter, and clearly there has been some recovery since. It's probably too early to celebrate. What you worry about is what the scarring to the economy has been, how many firms are going to have closed, never to reopen again, how many people have lost their jobs, never to get them back again, and how many households, especially the poorer ones, are now skimping and missing meals, taking their children out of school. How many children essentially have their education set back for years to come because they simply haven't had the means to keep up. So I think there is a substantial amount of damage. I think the signs for the big firms are, demand is back, but of course there's a lot of pent-up demand. We don't know how much is sustainable over the medium term, and if people have lost their jobs, if firms have closed down, it is going to have an effect on the long-term sustainable demand. So, I would say two things. One, we need to watch and wait and see how this plays out. Pranav Sen, a few days ago, the former chief statistician, had a very bleak interview on what he really thought was going on. But also, I think he made a very good point, which is that what really matters, and this is something I've been saying for some time, is the long-term scarring to the economy. What is our growth? We used to talk 8%, then we talk 6%. Now we probably have to talk 5 and less unless we really do what is necessary.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the points that Pranab Sen has been making is that he expects the quarter three numbers to be much worse, that he actually thinks that manufacturing has gone down in a sort of grave way. Now, we had the chief economic advisor talking about a V-shaped recovery. And people are going to latch on to the 7.5% to say that it's some sort of beginning. We have questions already on our live stream saying, do you see any reason to believe at all that there is any indication of a V-shaped recovery?
Well, recovery is always V-shaped till it stops being V-shaped, right?
Right,
Uh,
right.
from the depths of the first quarter, clearly we are coming back, and that's positive. It's good news. The question is how long it goes, and it may well go beyond it. This is what you see in Europe and the United States, that in their sort of calculation, because they have different fiscal years, it was the third quarter, which was a splendid recovery for them. That would be correspond to our second quarter. Of course, the fourth quarter is turning out to be quite bad because they have the resurgence of the virus in much of Europe and also in the United States. So, first, early days. Second, pent up demand. There is a substantial amount of pent up demand. Some people have built up savings, especially the richer and well off people. They spent it. Now, that is going to result in stronger demand for a while. The question is, what does it settle down to? And if you have the levels of unemployment that CMI talks about, if you see the number of discouraged workers that are there in the data, my colleague Marianne Bertrand tells me that a number of people have left the workforce. If all that is true, then incomes over the medium term are going to be lower than what you might otherwise expect, which means that effectively you go back down to a lower level than you were before. For sure, the trajectory is good. The question is how long it lasts. And I don't think anybody really knows that, in fact, it is going to go back to where it was.
Now, one of the points that you've been making is that this is not just a consequence of COVID. Of course, the lockdown has played its part, and the jury's certainly out on whether the lockdown was a smart idea. Personally, having traveled across India, I actually believe that it was a copy and paste Western idea that didn't apply very well to countries like ours. But you have been making the point that there have been previous, what you've called jhatkas to the economy, demonetization, an ill-conceived or an ill-executed rollout of the GST, and then COVID. Do you see any sort of cogency in any of the interventions that have been made by the government thus far?
Well, thus far is a very strong indictment, and I wouldn't go there. What I would say is, if you look at the history of this government, it has been quite good at redistribution. Finding ways to send money to households in different forms, whether it's the Ujjwala Yojana, whether it is the Shauchalaya, the toilets. It's been sort of effective. Now, we need to see longer term whether the objectives have been achieved there. And that requires careful study. But those redistributive mechanisms have been good. Where it has not succeeded is in maintaining growth. And this is the point, growth came down steadily. Now, if you spending money, but you're not earning it, what happens? You run larger and larger deficits. That's effectively what happened before the pandemic. We were running a huge fiscal deficit, but this government is also very good at masking the data. We did not know how bad it was. The Controller and Auditor General came out with a report which basically said, look, you are spending far more than you admit to. And the proof of that is during this pandemic, when the government should be spending more, it's unable to spend. In fact, the second quarter numbers that you saw, Mr. Sen made it a point to say the government is spending less at a time it should be spending more. So the point is that management at the macro level has been wanting. And part of the lack of growth is because of this policy by Jhatka. We come out with something dreamt up at the center with a fairly limited preparation. And when that happens, obviously a large economy of the kind we are now responds in ways that are unanticipated, and we haven't thought about what we would do if it responds in that way. and the effect is of setting back growth. And so I would say that kudos for the improvement in redistribution, but we must also worry about growth, and that's where this government has not done enough. And unfortunately, with what is happening in the pandemic, the long-term damage to the economy may be significant, and that is another concern, that we will not go back to anywhere near the growth levels we need to keep the young employed.
Yeah, let's go back to two big comments that you've made. One is that you said the government is very good at masking the data. I do remember even previous interviews with you where you actually had reached the conclusion that we need somebody from outside India to actually look at our data, because basically the data is not necessarily plausible. There are also spaces where the government says we don't know the data. For example, migrant workers, how many migrant workers died, how many migrant workers lost their lives, and so on. When you say the government is good at masking the data, are you saying that this near 24% contraction could be much higher? One. Two, which are the spaces in which you believe the data may have been masked?
Look, I don't think the point is about fudging the data as much as it is that the emphasis. Take for example what you started out with, the State Bank of India saying we're better than 49 countries. So big deal. We're really worried about our own pace. Remember, we were saying we are the fastest growing large economy in the world. I hope you remember that, because that was very prominent everywhere you went. So shouldn't the metric be how far we've fallen from being the fastest growing economy in the world? And how do we get back there? So that's the sense in which the emphasis keeps changing. We find the comparison which is most apt, neglect the data which are problematic and which are worrisome. And that sort of, it's political. Many governments would do it, but it is a problem. Second, it is true that Indian statistics aren't, as comprehensive and as timely as you might want them to be. When you look at, for example, how GDP is produced, and you look at the details, it's like a sausage factory. You simply don't want to know how it's done, because if you knew how it was done, you would worry about. And this is not just India; it's almost every country. There are lots of estimates. So, for example, when you asked, could it be worse? It could be, because one of the things that is done, a point that Mr. Pranab Sen also made, is that you estimate the growth of the small and medium sectors from the growth of the large firms. And of course, large firms have been very differentially affected. They have more resources to stay alive during this pandemic than the small firms. So if that's the case, then estimating using the large firms is probably overstating the fact. Now, the statistics organization basically said we're sort of trying to adjust for a lot of things. We are essentially trying to go with what we have and our intuition, etc. So it could go either way. Maybe they've adjusted enough. Maybe they've adjusted too little. We'll know only a few years down the line. So there's a combination of emphasis and there's a combination of we don't collect enough timely data. There's also, we don't collect data which doesn't please us. The unemployment data, for example, we stopped collecting. So, we need to do better on all this.
And the other big statement you made was on policy by Jhatka. Now, obviously, you've already identified demonetization and the GST rollout as two examples of that. What we don't actually know is your view on the new farm laws. And I ask you this at a time when I've spent an entire day with the farmers on the road. I'm not an economist. I think a lot of lay people in India just want to understand, is this good for farmers? Is this pro-reform or is it pro-crony capitalism? There's a sense, and those opposing it certainly believe that this is going to further concentrate capital in the hands of a few. Harish Damodaran has said that it is one more evidence of India moving towards conglomerate capitalism from entrepreneurial capitalism, which I thought was a very interesting phrase. And I think that you have expressed similar reservations about the concentration of power and capital in the hands of very few, big oligarchs almost. So when you look at the farm laws, how do you look at them, Professor Rajan?
First, I would like to say that the tendency towards concentration has been with us for some time. In 2008, 2009, I made a speech to the Bombay Chamber of Commerce, wondering whether India was becoming an oligarchy. And that comes from the fact that our corporations have enormous sway over our institutions. Certainly, some corporations seem to have that. And it seems to persist government after government. And the question is, can we build strong enough institutions to resist that? One example is the Competition Commission of India, which a government created. Obviously, that was creditable. The question is, how much power does it have to reject the concentration of power, or will it find reasons to say, oh, yes, this is okay, that is okay, and something else is okay? So we need to monitor these institutions and make sure they are working as advertised. And that, I think, is one place where we're doing reasonably well. We certainly have a engaged academia, for example. I've been reading some tracts by lawyers and legal scholars on the performance of the Supreme Court. And that, now is using a lot more data to understand how the judgments are going, what the time delay in judgments are, et cetera, so that we are trying to hold them up to a higher standard. So I think those are good things in a trend which we need to really deal with. On the Farm Bill itself, I'm not an expert on farm law. I do understand that the basic debate is on whether there will be more competition for the farmers' produce or less. And the ones who say there will be less basically argue that once you've done away with the mandis, you've not got enough business in the mandis, they will collapse. When they collapse, the farmer will have no choice but to go to the conglomerate buyers, to the multinational buyers, etc., which will squeeze the farmer. That's the argument against. Slipped into that argument is that the farmer will not get minimum support prices because somehow that's connected to this whole structure. Now, the pro argument, which a lot of economists have been making for some time, is that no, if those structures are useful, they will stand regardless, and the farmer will have more choice. Now, ideally, what you would want to do is essentially ensure both structures can compete with each other, support the mandi, at the same time ensure that there is competition from these other sources, and then see whether the farmer is getting a better deal. So I've said before, we sometimes do reform as a fire and forget missile. We sort of shoot it and think all is done. No, you need to keep looking at the reform, see how it works, and deal with the problems that emerge. So if, for example, the mandis start closing down, start thinking about whether you need to have some subsidy for some time in the mandis till you ensure that the situation is comparative. How do you compensate the state governments for the revenue lost in the mandis? That's something to think about. I think the fair criticism is that some of these reforms are undertaken. We've spent many years talking about them. How would it be? Why would it be a problem to just consult a little more and find out something that is mutually acceptable? Because in that consultation, you may actually find a better way forward. So that's really the concern, that sometimes, again, we're doing this without the inputs from the relevant parties, and that may take us down the wrong path. But even if we did that, I would still say it's not over yet. Monitor, see what's happening, and if the critics have a point, adjust. And that we need to keep doing. Last point. Why is it that we do it this way? Well, because policy has been so centralized. India cannot be run from the center. India, you need the center for an overall vision, but then the details have to be worked out and managed on a much more decentralized basis.
Well,
I don't think we, on the economic front, the overall vision the coherence of the overall vision is not there. But we have a lot of policy emanating from the center, without the kind of buy-in or the decentralization that is necessary.
Well, that was going to be my response. That irrespective of where you stand on the law itself, when you have thousands of men and women on the streets for 6 days in a row, who are the backbone of your agricultural sector, you do find a way to create consensus and dialogue. The second question I had on the farm laws as a follow up was that there has been a suggestion that if the government is committed to a minimum support price, which at least rhetorically the Prime Minister downwards have said that there will be no change in the MSP, then one model that has been suggested is that you ensure that private players do not actually buy at a price below the MSP for that year, and that you can easily work that into the law. So yes, if private players are willing to pay more, hurrah for the farmers, but at least you set a threshold and you say no trading below this level. Is that not a way to marry what you were calling the encouragement of competition, but also, in a way, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
I think there are a variety of fixes that are possible, and again, taking the critics on board and ensuring that the intent of the reform. Again, I don't think the government intends to hurt the farmers through this reform. If that is the case, then by all means, a dialogue would be useful, and there may be some suggestions which can be implemented, which would assuage all sides and make this a better reform. Certainly, what you want really is stronger incomes for the farmers. That is the intent. And the intent can be achieved both by more competition, but also if you have set a minimum support price, by all means enforce it where you can.
Are you leaning towards seeing this as a reformist measure? You've had you have a caveat that policy does not have to be formulated in this way. There can be a consensus orientation towards policy, and I get that. But that's more how the policy is executed or enforced per se. Do you lean towards seeing this as a pro-reform move, or do you believe that nowhere in the world actually has the farmer not been subsidized in some way or the other?
No, look, there are two different things. One is competition for the farmers' produce, and the other is subsidy. Many farmers in India don't benefit from the minimum support prices because procurement is not done in their particular neighborhood or in their particular state. So more competition for their produce from all, rather than them being forced to go to one mandi and to sell there, in theory is a good thing. Now, the concern that people have is if that sole source of competition, the mandi, collapses, and then you're subject to all these other buyers who have no constraint on what price they pay. You can do both, and that means a gentle transition. And at some point, if the mandi doesn't really serve a purpose because there's a huge amount of competition for the farmer, multinationals are competing with corporates, are competing with traditional traders, then at that point you can let it go. So I think you don't need to take a step in the dark. You can work with the current structures, but add the competition as something over and above what is there. So how do you do that? How do you structure that? That's worth sort of discussing. But more competition, I would say, is undoubtedly a good thing for the farmer.
Yeah. Let's come to a policy where we do know your view and where you have been quite unequivocal about it, which is the RBI Internal Working Group's proposal to allow bank ownership to rest with corporates. Now, this has provoked a kind of strident debate within India. There are people who have supported you and your reservations about connected lending and said that borrowers, and promoters can't be the same entities. There are others who say that the consumer of India already expresses greater faith in private banks. There are those in the RBI who have given the example of Kotak Mahindra or Yes Bank as examples of banks that have already existed in the template which you are now, in a sense, opposing. So what do you sort of pinpoint as your key concern in this particular proposal of the RBI to allow bank ownership to rest with business houses?
Well, let's be careful about those two names. Yes Bank is not.
Yes, I know. Yes Bank
of
is a
great
bad example,
success.
but Kotak Mahindra?
And Kotak Mahindra is a very good bank. Uday Kotak runs it well. But Uday Kotak is not an industrialist. He's largely a finance. the RBI has no problem with people in the financial sector opening up banks. In fact, as I've said, the RBI allows houses that have even up to 40% of their business in industry to own banks. That's a pretty large opening for any people who want to own banks. The concern about having majority industrial houses, then doing a little bit of financial business, is the financial business can then become subservient to the needs of the larger business house. And to some extent, this was the problem we got away from. When the bank nationalizations took place, something you can certainly debate whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. Uh, so one issue is connected lending, and I've seen a lot of people saying, "Oh, but the committee said yes, we will stop connected lending." If we could stop connected lending by legal means or by fiat, we wouldn't have an NPA problem today. If you could just say, "Oh, banks, be careful," and they would be careful, there would be no problem. The reality is, for the low level of credit to GDP we have a huge NPA problem. And so, to that extent, I don't really understand these suggestions that somehow we will legislate it away or regulate it away. You create the bad incentives, it creates the workaround that corporations do, and it will create even worse of a problem. This is why many countries ban it. We keep looking to the U.S., for suggestions. Well, the U.S. doesn't have banking and commerce. Why don't we look into? They have pretty good regulators. Why is it that they fear that? That's something to think about. One. Second, concentration of power. You look at the directive principles of our constitution. It basically is saying we do not want concentration of economic power. You look at what we've done in the banking sector for a long time, it has been an attempt to reduce concentration of economic power, including when you have successful promoters, we ask them to bring down their stake over time because we don't want all that power to reside in one individual. So the point is, out of the blue, we've sort of again said that doesn't matter. Why? I mean, that is a big issue in this country and probably getting worse over time as we have, uh, more concentration and less competition.
But there's a question on our live stream that says, do you believe we have enough banks in India? If not, do you not think it's necessary to allow business houses who can bring large capital to start new banks? And I get what you're saying about the concentration of power, economic power, the potential conflict of interest. But how do you address this point that both private and public sector banks in India are probably equally susceptible to political pressure, manipulation, and so on? What is the way ahead then? What is the way ahead? It's clearly not nationalization.
I think the way ahead is fix the political. I think the way ahead is fix the political pressure. Don't add one more dimension, which is conflicted owners who would like to lend to their own enterprises, which are in difficulty. So the point really here is that it's not that we don't have enough banks. We have, when I last remember, around 90 scheduled commercial banks. It may have changed.
Yeah, I think it's 93 or something, but yeah, go ahead.
We have a lot of banks. The point is the public sector banks have not been lending because their books are clogged with bad loans. And the private sector banks are now very wary of lending given the economic environment. And the private sector banks are not industrial houses owned banks. They are, ICICI has a widespread board. Axis Bank has a publicly held board. Kotak has a central entrepreneur, but it has again many investors in Kotak. So the point is that there is a successful model. This kind of private bank, yes, there have been some shenanigans that have been revealed in the recent past, but they are nowhere near in terms of bad loans compared to the public sector banks. So if you want to open more banks, open it up to more of these entities. There are some finance business houses concentrated in finance who could potentially get a bank license. But the need of the hour is not necessarily more banks. It is cleaning up the problems in the current system and trying to give the public sector banks greater leeway to lend, but in a better way. They have been lending in a way that is calculated to create bad loans, not just in past governments, but look at the Mudra loans that were entirely created in this government. And you can see that the real problem, and compare small and medium enterprise loans by the public sector banks with small and medium enterprise loans by the private banks. And there's a huge difference in terms of their performance. And so the point really is you keep saying, oh, this is bad governance. Don't create an additional governance problem to deal with a past governance problem. Fix that past governance problem. You're not going to find a magic bullet. We know what the problems are. If you're not willing to fix them, don't create a new problem.
But you're saying that that instead of cleaning up the mess in the banking sector, instead of sort of getting rid of the potential conflicts of interest, we're only adding more if this proposal were to be enforced. When you look back at your whole sort of battle with banks and NPAs as RBI governor, and that's something that at least supporters of this government keep going back to, that you could have done something about this and you didn't, or you didn't do enough, and that's a criticism that they sometimes bring to your door. Can you speak to that battle that you tried to fight and where you ran into roadblocks?
It wasn't really a battle. There were bad loans piled up in the system because of the euphoria after the global financial crisis, or actually before the global financial crisis. And the global financial crisis took the air out of the system to some extent. A lot of infrastructure projects stuck, a lot of bad loans. And the reality was we needed to clean up. Now, as I became governor, the public sector banks had been steadily decreasing their lending growth every quarter relative to the private banks. And so the gap was wide. And that suggested there was a problem to be fixed. They needed to clean up their bad loans if they had to have a chance to lend again, and they needed to be recapitalized. So we went and saw what exactly was the size of the bad loans. And then we went to the government and said, here is the size of the bad loans. These need to be cleaned up. Let's start the process. Now, we need to prepare. Again, I don't think policy by Jhatka is the right thing. You need to prepare. We created a variety of structures so that the banks could actually restructure these loans once we gave them the mandate, or once we forced them to do that. So we examined them once again. This was the asset quality review. We found a number of banks which were actually not reporting the true size of the problem. We told them, here's the size of the problem, start reporting and start cleaning up. They had both the pressure to do it and the ability to do it. And by the time I left, GDP was still very strong. It was an 8 or 9% quarter. But the cleaning up needed to continue at that pace. We had a measured process of cleaning up. The government brought in the IBC around that time, the bankruptcy code. That helped. So I think the process of cleaning up was underway. Two issues: it didn't go as fast as it should have. We should have cleaned up by 2018, 20. That would have made us better prepared to meet this crisis. And second, the government should have put far more capital into the public sector banks. But third, and this is where I think we were stymied, trying to reform the governance of the banks. We tried to make it more professional. We tried to insist that the boards be more formed of more professionals. My worry is that the bureaucrats were never seized of that, and never actually carried that out.
And thereby, what would be your proposal to clean up the banking system? Because you're obviously virulently against this method. Is it your sense that it will go through? Is it your sense that it will go through?
I don't want to speculate. I mean, I think there's enough concerns raised about this report.
Yeah.
That it is important, if you ever want to do it, to get a much wider group of people to opine. I am surprised that there were no sort of serious bankers. There were no serious sort of academics who specialize in actually banking and finance, and we have a number in India, typically reports that make such an important pronouncement tend to have a lot of opinions when, especially when the path is 180 degrees to what was previously on the cards. So I would say, given the controversy, it makes sense. I mean, one line in the report stands out that all but one expert advised against it. And I don't see a lot of argument in the paper, in the internal working group's suggestions as to why it overrode all those experts and came out with the recommendation it did. I see even less for the recommendation. Earlier, payment banks were to be just as they were. In 2019, the RBI said, oh, you can migrate to small finance banks after 5 years as a payment bank. This report says you can do it after 3 years. What's the urgency? Who's waiting on the sidelines to get in? Why do it now? I don't know. There's nothing in the report which explains why this needs to be done.
But that is the policy by Jhatka that you referenced in other contexts, right?
I don't know, but the RBI has a history of doing it the right way, of getting outside experts with capabilities in the area being examined. There's no reason why we shouldn't do it again.
I have one more question on this. You spoke about India can't be governed from the center. Now, India has increasingly a centralization of political power. Do you apprehend that economic power is kind of headed in the same direction? And again, I'll borrow from Harish's phrase, conglomerate capitalism. And I'm no communist or left of center person. I'm an absolute capitalist. But I think there are genuine concerns that both political and economic power will rest with very few entities in the India that is now emerging?
Well, I think you have to look at other countries to understand the dangers of such a structure, right? And just 1 second, something is
sure.
You have to understand the dangers of such a structure. Look at Latin America. Look at what you see in some countries like Philippines. The concentration of economic power, coupled with the concentration, of political power, tend to feed on each other, and eventually that becomes detrimental for democracy, right? Because now what the political leaders need to do is just appease a few big industrialists. The big industrialists are in bed with the political leaders, and the net effect is that the broader mass of people get ignored. Their interests in policies become less critical than the fact that you have enough money to fight elections, and you have far more money than any in the opposition. Do we want to go there? That's the big concern. And my sense is, you see this in the United States also. Every time you talk capitalism, you would say that the United States is certainly a capitalist country. But every time you get a concentration of economic power in the United States, there is a reaction to cut it down to size. It happened when Rockefeller owned Standard Oil. It happened when Bill Gates owned Microsoft. It is happening now with big tech. There is a reaction which says, you're too big, you're too powerful, you're too politically sort of entrenched. And before it becomes irreversible, we need to act on this. This is why we have a competition commission, to ensure that there is not a concentration of economic power. This is why the RBI insists that you bring down your stake in a bank if you have too much once it's successful. This is why we said no corporations in banking. Part of the reason why we said that. It is something that has worked reasonably well for India. I mean, I would say our industrialists are still too pliant or still too cozy with politicians. But it is a work in progress. And you can see the new generation of industrialists, the Naushad Forbes, the Narayan Murthis, are less willing to be sort of seen as compliant, Rajiv Bajaj. So my sense is we will move there. provided we can keep concentration relatively limited.
But isn't the difference between the US, where you're quite correct, the pushback against Amazon, Google, Facebook right now is quite fascinating to watch. But the difference between India and the US is that there you do not need as much government to do business as you need in India, and therefore the people you name, Noshad, Rajiv, these are people who are also displaying a measure of spine, and they're taking risks with pushback, political pushback when they take the positions that they do. Everybody is not willing to take that position. There's also a fear that regulatory watchdogs have not worked as they should. If you look at the telecom sector, for example, you now have just a handful of players. You're seeing consolidations, you're seeing mergers. Now, one way of looking at it is that's Darwinian, it's the nature of the market. The other way of looking at it is that monopolies aren't being contained, that the Competition Commission isn't quite doing its job.
I think the Telecom Authority has been singularly deficient on ensuring competition in the telecom sector. I mean, that's why we end up with three players, one of whom is already very weak. So what did they do wrong? I mean, certainly we need to analyze what went wrong, why a certain kind of lack of competition with all our, some of the foreign competitors withdrawing. I mean, we need to learn from that and make sure it doesn't happen, instead of trying to move the same kind of structure to other industries. That would be problematic down the line. So one, study the telecom experience. Maybe all this was not ordained, and it just was a set of mistakes. But understand what went wrong. Did the telecom authority, was it too lax to certain practices? Did it favor certain entities too much on certain occasions? That's something to think about. And second, are we in danger of doing that now? For example, in the banking sector, should we be careful? That's what I think we need to keep thinking.
Okay, let's step back and look at the larger picture. The IMF report that actually puts Bangladesh ahead of India in terms of economic performance. I think that has been to refer back to what you were saying in the beginning. You can't keep shifting the goalposts. You had dreams for your own economic performance, and then you get this reality check in the form of the IMF report, which says that Bangladesh's per capita GDP to grow at 4% in financial year 21. How do you look at this benchmarking with Bangladesh, Raghu? Phone going off, but so we'll just let you get that as we look at the numbers there. Go ahead, Professor Rajan.
Again, this is the point about goalposts. Who do we measure ourselves up with? And for a long time, we thought that certain entities were below us. I mean, Bangladesh, if you look at what it's done, it's done spectacularly on certain dimensions, including, for example, look at its textile exports. Now, do we want the same kinds of crowded textile factories, or have we dealt with that problem? That's something to certainly debate. I wouldn't say there aren't deficiencies in Bangladesh, but the proof of the pudding is that they've started growing very fast in a significant way over the last so many years. And they've caught up with us. We thought they were a basket case, and they're not. And in fact, they're doing better than us on certain dimensions. Certainly on, for example, microfinance, they've done. They have spectacular innovations. So the point is that similarly, if you look at COVID and the fight against COVID, there are some countries in Africa that have done better than us. We would typically not compare ourselves with those because we think they're poor developing countries while we are an emerging market. So one can always find examples of success. The point is not to denigrate that or look down upon that. It is to understand why they've done so well. So one of the things we must recognize is we've done really poorly on creating growth over the last so many years. And again, I won't say it's just this government. We have been, we could have done better in the past also. So how do we re-energize growth? How do we create more jobs? That is something we need to be thinking about. And earlier, in the 1980s, China was the reason we moved, because it took away the excuse large countries like us cannot grow fast. China started growing fast, and we had the impetus to grow fast. Now, we may say China has a different system of government. They managed it somehow. But Bangladesh has a similar system of government. It is a democracy. I mean, again, with all the problems. Uh, so if
But
Bangladesh
just
can
to,
do it,
just to
why aren't we
jump in
doing
there,
it?
I was spotting a question on my live stream saying that you have been speaking against the centralization of power, but Bangladesh is also about centralization of power. Hasina is a very powerful leader. It's not necessarily a place where power is that
I
distributed.
That is why I said with all its problems.
Right.
I am saying that it has its problems, and yet it's doing a little better. I'm not holding Bangladesh up as a model of democracy for us to emulate. I'm just saying that given all the problems of South Asia, which they have, given that they came from the same stock that we did pre-independence, they seem to be doing. They seem to have beaten us on per capita GDP, which is a measure, one measure, not the only measure of economic well-being. So there are lessons in there. What is it that they're doing well? And I wouldn't say the lesson is centralization. I would say the lesson is how are they doing in facilitating the growth of their industries, especially their exports in textiles. What is it they're doing? Now they have some preferences we don't, and that's something that is different. But they have been taking business from China. Similarly, what are they doing on the microfinance side? We have learned a little bit from them. Should we learn more? Again, let us listen and analyze the best, but let us be prepared to say that doesn't work for us. We can't simply import that model. There has special characteristics. But let's understand before we dismiss it, and then take what is best for us. So being open to ideas doesn't necessarily mean being a slave to those ideas.
Let's be a little prescriptive. We have about 10 minutes left. If you've spoken about government needing to spend more, the need to create stimulus in these post-COVID times, but there's also about what that money should be spent on, where that money should be directed. For example, the project to recreate the Central Vista in the national capital, it has created a ferocious debate. There are people who think it's money well spent. There are people who think this is completely almost amoral to do at a time like this. It's almost as tone deaf as celebrities who are posting their holiday pictures from Maldives at a time when migrant workers have been displaced by the millions that they have. How do you see a project like that? Where do you think the stimulus needs to be created?
I would say that there is a need for stimulus in infrastructure. I do not know this is not a cop out, but I do not know the details of the Central Vista project, how needed it is,
But
etc.
instinctively, like obviously the knee-jerk feeling is, why do you need this? But maybe that's just me.
If there was infrastructure spending that was more critical, I would do it. But infrastructure is difficult to do in this country simply because the ability to set it up, to acquire the land, to plan it in a reasonable way takes a long time. What Why infrastructure is particularly beneficial now is it employs a lot of people, a lot of labor which would not get a job otherwise, typically low skilled labor. It creates the opportunity to use materials like copper, iron, aluminum, cement, and so on, and therefore acts as a boost to industry. Going forward, we will need that kind of stimulus, and why not spend it on things we need? So, to the extent that the Central Vista is needed, right, I would say by all means it should be part of the agenda. To the extent it's crowding out projects that are more needed, for example, critical roads, critical railways, I wouldn't do it. Now, it really depends on now. However, bringing these infrastructure projects forward is going to be necessary because after this boost of demand we see in the first few months of the recovery, we're going to see some falling off. And that's why these kinds of infrastructure projects, bringing them forward, makes absolute sense. I will leave aside, is this needed or not? I don't know. I haven't gone into the details of the project.
But speaking prescriptively, what should this government, looking at this data, what's and all, be focusing on right now?
I think the first thing is obviously to see whether the weaker sections of society have enough taking them forward. If you look at some of these surveys, you do worry that consumption has fallen, especially including of food. So, are people getting enough nutrition, especially the families that have lost jobs? So that is, I think, one, and that's also, I mean, if you transfer money to them, they're also more able to spend because they spend a bigger fraction of their income, and that's going to be a boost to demand. But I think the boost to demand is secondary to the moral principle of keeping of keeping people away from hunger. The second, I think, is to see how many small and medium enterprises are in stress, and to find ways of helping them both on the credit side but also on the demand side. Now, some of our larger firms have access to money, but they also have long supply chains. So, are there ways we can encourage them to look after the smaller firms in their supply chain? I mean, some of them may do it instinctively. Some of them may say, "He's just one supplier to me." There are others who. So, I would basically start looking at the damage that has been done. Now, a lot of this is hidden because we have moratoria on payments. Firms look like they're profitable, but some of it, as Mr. Pranab Sen said, could come from getting rid of employees. So we need a better sense of where the damage is and start tackling that much more directly. We need to have a sense of urgency about that. This belief of a V-shaped recovery, I think, stands against that because it makes us complacent. Things are fine. We don't need to do anything more. No, in fact, we probably have a very damaged economy. Where is the damage? How do we start repairing it? And part of the answer is also going to be export more because we are have insufficient domestic demand. We have to be more open to exports, but often more open to exports means more open to imports. So stop erecting huge barriers to the import of intermediate goods which are necessary to create the export. So we need to have a coherent strategy about how we will recover, and I would like to see that articulated.
Okay, let me spend the last few minutes asking you about, what you see as the relationship between social stability and economic health. And I ask you this because when you were RBI governor, this is a comment that you made often, that you need a certain amount of inclusive stability in society for economic well-being to take place. Some of your comments were not especially liked, at least by this government. Now, The Economist did a story right now calling India a diminishing democracy. There are people here who thought this was a kind of foreign media stereotyping. If you, from your perch, looking at what's happening here, there are legislations against what the BJP calls love jihad, which is really interfaith marriages. There are farmers on the streets. There's the situation in Kashmir, which is a different and more complex debate. How do you think the world is looking at India right now?
Well, there are two issues. One, what is the world seeing? And two, what is the reality, right? And let me put aside the reality. I mean, the fact is, there are very few respected publications that see India currently as improving its democratic structure. In fact, most of them think it's going the other way. Now, India used to be a beacon for democracy. It is certainly, the US still thinks of it as part of the Quad structure, for example, of democracies and so on. But it is as you put it, seen as a weaker democracy, as more authoritarian. Now, some of this may be the tremendous strength of the BJP right now, and if we had a stronger opposition, then perhaps it's not so much the structure of the country has changed, but the nature of the present sort of forces. But again, a lot of academics, and this here I'm turning to academic, worry. In fact, there's an Oxford academic who talks about changing democracy by 1,000 cuts. That there is a steady weakening of the institutions. And that's something to keep in mind because one of India's strengths has been fairly strong institutions for a country of its income. a strong election commission, a relatively independent Supreme Court, a strong Reserve Bank. These are the institutions we have to protect. And if we weaken these institutions, it puts less, a strong competition commission, it puts less in the way of the accumulation of political and economic power. So I would say, one, the perception is of weakening, but that perception is related to a feeling that the institutions have been steadily undermined over time. And if we want to reverse that perception, it has to be by strengthening our institutions, because those institutions benefit us, not just by preserving a democratic sort of structure, but also making us function better as a country, whether it be on the economic sphere or the political sphere.
I mean, I was interviewing Fareed Zakaria a couple of days ago, and he said that India was beginning to seem to him more and more like Erdogan's Turkey than the country of his origin. As someone who has been, you've never given up your Indian citizenship. Do you see India like that? Or, there was another very moving piece by Andy Mukherjee in Bloomberg where he said that he felt he'd lost hope in the India he knew. Do you feel that? Do you sometimes lose hope in the India you remember and that you know?
No, I don't lose hope in India. I think we've been through days when we have become less democratic. I mean, remember the emergency, but we've come back from that. I don't think we are in that situation right now, but I do think we have to worry about the steady erosion of institutions, and that is an early sign that things are going the wrong direction. This is a temptation for any structure where you have tremendous political power concentrated in one party. It was a problem when all the power was concentrated in the Congress. It is a problem now when a lot of power is concentrated in the BJP. What is important is the parties themselves realize some of the dangers inherent in this kind of concentration, and along with the general polity of the country, work to try and make it that we don't move down the undemocratic path over time. That requires concentrated effort on everyone's part. I get accused of being a constant critic of the government. In fact, what I'm trying to do is offer constructive criticism. Here's what you must do. Here is what you mustn't do. I mean, I have in mind, there's a lot of sort of flack that Dr. Manmohan Singh sometimes gets. I remember, in 2012, I was on a panel with him. There were three others. This was while he was Prime Minister. There was Ishar Ahluwalia, there was T.N. Nainan, and there was Governor Subbarao. This was on the performance of the government. The four panelists, maybe with the exception of Dr. Subbarao, were really fierce in the steady drift we had seen. And Dr. Manmohan Singh, sitting on the panel in front of a large audience, I think it was Vigyan Bhavan, essentially said nothing, got up at the end and said, "You have given me a lot of food for thought. Let me, I'm not going to respond and try and defend. You are all reasonable people. Let me think about it and do what is necessary." That, to my mind, represents the best of Indian democracy. A prime minister who's lambasted by people who I was an advisor to the prime minister. Ishar Ahluwalia was a friend of the prime minister. By people who cared about the direction of the country. A lot of us care about the direction of the country. We're trying to give advice. We're trying to suggest here's a better way. You may think we're wrong, but take it into account. Don't accuse us of being sort of constant critics and not interested in progress. We are interested in progress.
Does that hurt you, or have you developed a thicker hide? Because, and the reason that I'm asking is that several years ago, I asked you whether you would ever consider a role in public life or politics, and you said that your wife would not hear of it. Many years on, the number of comments on my live stream that want to know why you won't come back to India and be part of political life, be part of public life. It's been many years since that moment, and I do want to ask you whether you've had an opportunity to reconsider that, whether you would consider either a role in politics or in public life or in government.
No, look, I am certainly I care very much about India. Otherwise, I would, I don't do research on India, but I certainly care about what goes on there. And if I didn't care, I wouldn't spend time with you or others trying to push gently or sometimes harder in particular directions. I have no sort of vested interest in that process. Uh, but there are people who are capable of doing politics and playing politics and managing politics, and I certainly don't consider that my forte. I am certainly happy to advise and to push as far as I can. That I think different strokes for different folk, or you should be cognizant of what you're competent at. My realm is more the realm of ideas than, and on occasion administration, than of.
But you just mentioned Manmohan Singh, who was not an electoral politician either, who was probably more a man of ideas than he was that quintessential electoral politician. So there are many ways, Raghu, to be in politics without being an electoral politician. So the more specific question is, maybe you're saying you'd be no good at contesting elections, but would you be open to a different role from being, this great professor? Would you consider coming back to India and being part of a government?
Look, I actually need to learn far more about India, and I want to do that. But I also think that the deficiency, and I mean, this is the deficiency is for a alternative vision right now to the dominant vision. And I think it's important to create that. There's no point sort of being part of the political establishment if you don't offer a serious alternative. And that's what I think a lot of us in India have to work on. What is the alternative to the dominant vision?
And are you willing to spend more time in India doing that? I don't know. And how do you define that role?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are trying to find a way to figure out what what is going wrong. Why is our growth falling off? Why are people unhappy? What is the have we met the dreams of our founding fathers? I spent a lot of time reading the Constitution and the how the Constitution was structured, what Ambedkar said, what Gandhi said. And I think it's important to go back to that and to understand, have we met those aspirations or have we fallen off? And if we have fallen off, how do we get back on track? India was a beacon of democracy for the rest of the world. It punched above its weight in international fora because it was thought of as leader of the developing world. How do we get back to some of that? Those are the things we need to think about. And as I said, my comparative advantage is in ideas, not in shaking hands and kissing babies.
But I was hoping politics has moved beyond that. But just to end, will we therefore, as you look for ways to create an alternative that has resonance and isn't just in an echo chamber of fellow liberals, will we expect to see you in more of you here?
I think we need to develop those ideas. Yes, obviously we need, and I think Indian academia has a responsibility. I think even Indian politicians across the spectrum, including people from the BJP, have to be thinking about what are we going in the right direction, and what are the alternatives to what we could be doing.
Well, I think there's a riddle there in your last answer, and I'm going to have to do a follow-up interview with you. But I think what I'm hearing, let me summarize this correctly, is that you're not looking at, you don't see yourself as a quintessential politician, but you're definitely going to be more engaged with the public issues of our time, maybe than you have been. Would that be fair to say?
I think I would say that India's going through a very critical phase at this time, economically, politically, every dimension. And this is a time that all Indians should step up and say, what is it that we really want from our country? What direction do we want to go? Are we going in the right direction? And that, I think, as an Indian, I feel it's a responsibility to step up and to start thinking about what we need to do.
Well, thank you. I know everybody, I've just got a flood of comments saying convince him, let him come back, contest elections and so on. But I'm going to pick that up, threads up of that with you in our next conversation. Learned a lot. I know our viewers learned a lot. Thank you for your time. You spent a good 60 minutes with us, and it's been brilliant having a civil, interesting, robust conversation. I wish more conversations could be like this. Raghuram Rajan, pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.